Good morning and welcome back, everybody. And thank you for that sensational start to the conference. My head is spinning, Philip, after your presentations and what is possible. And we're going to take that one step further with our industry discussion with our CEOs and leaders right now. My name's MacDermott. I'm an engagement advisor to Building 4.0 CRC, and it's my real pleasure to moderate what's going to be a fascinating conversation this morning with our property leaders as we tackle the big issues. And we've been speaking about them. We've been speaking about our national housing crisis, our record building insolvencies, the urgent need to relife our CBD buildings if our cities are going to meet the housing and community needs that they do for the next generations, and how we do all this as we're forging ahead with our net zero emission environment and goals. And we saw a bit about what is possible, but I have to say I was talking to Mike Zorbas, CEO of the Property Council, about why aren't we hearing and discussing more of this locally, and I think that's a great opportunity to take this conversation further. So firstly, my great pleasure to introduce our panel today. From far right, I'll go this way.
Yeah, I don't want to be far right.
Sorry. The only time you could be described that, Cameron. Okay, all right. To my immediate here, CEO of our 4.0 CRC, Professor Mathew Aitchison. And Mathew, that was a great opening this morning and talking about innovation and the culture of innovation. I love that capture. We have our Senior Research Manager for the Green Building Council of Australia and World GBC, Helen Bell, who's been very involved with the CRC. Thanks, Helen. Mike Zorbas, CEO, Property Council of Australia. Selina Short, Built Environment and Resources Managing Partner at EY, a Director of the Green Building Council of Australia as well, and CEO of the Australian Institute of Architects, Cameron Bruhn. So thank you all for joining us and for making time. We have 55 minutes to tackle some of the country's most pressing issues. And I'm going to start with asking each of our panellists to give us an opening statement about what their vision of doing bigger, better and bolder looks like to them. Cameron, after describing you earlier in that phrase, I'm going to let you take the reins.
Excellent, thank you. So, better, bolder and more sustainable. I'm going to break it down into those three sections by starting by observing that the thing we probably need to do better is work together. And this is across all levels of government and within all of the professions that shape the built environment. I spent the last 5 years in education and observed that many of the habits that we try to break in boardrooms and on building sites as professionals are made in the universities. So that life journey for all built environment professionals through the process needs to emphasise working together. And I guess that bigger project that sits with that is how do we de-silo the built environment and the way in which it's built, developed and managed. I'd observe that the regulation of the architectural profession is just 100 years old in Australia in these years. Victoria was last year, I think New South Wales the year before. So in the very long history of building, the regulation and the way in which we define the professions is a very young thing, and perhaps we could lean in a little to that youth as a way of deconstructing some of those boundaries to collaboration and innovation. On the point of bolder, I think there's a big question here about the way in which we think about expertise and the role of the expert. And I think across our professions, we've probably observed over the last 10 to 20 years a devaluing of expertise and of the role of the expert within the built environment. And I'd point to the idea of the design review panels, and that instrument as a really good indicator of the way in which we could, in the built environment, make better use of the various expertise that we all bring to the table. A more sustainable future will only come from reaching net zero and being much more honest, I think, about what the barriers are to getting there. we all have our own, I guess, amongst the professions, understanding of how we individually might get there. But returning to that first point, it's only when there's a collective vision about how to create a sustainable future and how to reach the goals we've set for 2030 and 2050 that we might be actually able to create a roadmap for how to get there.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here and great to see so many faces, and I really enjoyed catching the tail end of the presentation before, and we have not compared notes, but it's actually really interesting hearing what you're saying, because I was dwelling on that a lot as I was thinking about what does bigger, bolder, better look like. And I think for me, what it means is to skate towards complexity. I think human nature means what we really want is the simple answer, the silver bullet, the easy path. And I'm not sure it's going to be news to anyone here, but that is not on the table in the world that we operate in and with the problems that we have got to solve. So my big thing is, how do we skate to complexity? How do we embrace the complexity? And as we look to build a building, solve a challenge, get something operating better, how do we actually seek to layer in the complexity and solve multiple problems? And what's required there is exactly what you were talking about, Cameron. We need those ecosystems because no single brain can hold all of that. No single company can hold all of that. And that's where places like the CRC can make huge leaps forward. So how do we do that? And if you look at Melbourne, for example, you know, you forward forecast out to 2050 and it'll be a city of 8 million people, and that is the year where we are meant to be at this, you know, wonderful sort of net zero nirvana. That means if you look at the built environment, we need to be electrifying 77 buildings a year to be able to get there by 2050. At the moment, that's 7. So that just gives you some sense of the scale of the problem and the innovation and the solutions we need to bring. So for me, it is absolutely about that collaboration, and it's about trying to not seek the silver bullet and actually give complexity a ginormous big hug.
Said, can anyone not? No, you can all hear me, I'm sure. I love being in the centre, Kathy. Thank you.
That's lucky.
Neither far right or far left. Totally agree with what you both said. I think for me, and looking at this morning's presentations too, it did make me think we have the same problems, Philip, that you do in Germany. Like, we are undercooked on construction, whether that's skilled or unskilled. We've got a massive amount of housing backlog to fill. I'd say something as a passion statement, actually. It is a national tragedy that, and unlike Germany, we've got a very small population, so we're 55th roughly in the world by population, 26.4 million people. We've got the 6th largest landmass, as you inferred in your commentary, and we're super wealthy. You know, we're somewhere between 12 and 15 on the global economic scale, GDP-wise, and yet we have this massive housing deficit relative to all those riches that I've just named, and that is one of the real strange aspects of modern policy, that we've got to this point, and it's only this year, for the first time since we federated, that a Prime Minister has got together with all the relevant premiers and said, we're going to tackle this together. And I don't want to overblow the potential there, but it is a very important moment to collaborate in the way that you were both talking about. For the first time, our leaders have taken on a philosophy of government approach where they're trying to be accountable. Now, there are a lot of things that could go wrong with that, but I think it's incredibly important that we give this a real try. It hasn't been done before. It may not be done well this first time around, but those targets, that 1.2 million, and I think we're going to talk about this a bit more, but that to me is a real passion project. I've only been in the chair of the Property Council for the last 7 or 8 months, but I really think, you know, we've got to back this in as an industry very, very hard. That does not mean compromising on, you know, the right location, on public transport, on sustainability. That means leaning into that as well, because the overarching thing that I took out of this morning, and from what you were both saying, is we've got to do the good things faster. This is complex, and we're going to have to say there are 6 things to do, not 3. It can't be done by the basic ministerial press release, you know, and I had this conversation with the building ministers on Friday, You know, the first time they've got into a room with industry is almost 12 months into the new government. Actually, when there's a whole bunch of vocations sitting there, you know, the architects were there, of course, Cameron, and, you know, GBCA was there. We need to be talking very closely, very quickly, on a regular basis. These trajectories that need to be met, they're not going to meet themselves. We do need to lean into that together. So I think faster and certainly with a real eye to how we mix up the workforce in particular. If you look at something like Victoria, right here, we're targeting 800,000 new homes by 2034. That would require a radical uplift from 59,000 per year to 80,000 per year. That's going to require a lot more skilled and unskilled trades than we currently have. And we're doing a big build, just like Queensland's doing a pre-Olympics build, just like New South Wales has been doing a whole bunch of stuff. And we've got the green revolution, which we want to lean into as far as that power infrastructure goes. That's a war for talent on three fronts. And not all of those are equal in terms of what the contractor is offering. You know, governments are often more generous, offering a longer term tenure. You know, so how we get that skills mix right is a critical element, I think, of meeting a lot of these challenges as well. Some of that is technology. Some of that is the stuff that Philip is talking about, obviously, too. You know, how do we really bake in that innovation? More than enough from me. I should pass on.
Thanks, Mike.
And can everyone hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me here today and for all being here. As a research manager at the GBCA, seeing this many people interested in research and innovation is mind-blowing, but also so important and exactly what we need if we're going to meet these incredibly ambitious targets that we've all been hearing about. Because you people in the room are the ones who are going to be delivering the change and the innovation that we need to meet those higher level national, like local council, state, national, and then international targets. At an international level, the World GBC sees sustainability as, well, what we're trying to do, and from a World GBC perspective, is better, bolder, and more sustainable buildings. With that, we've got climate action as number one, and we've heard a lot about that, and we'll continue to hear about it over the rest of the day. But we've also got more broader aspects. We've got health and well-being, which we saw during COVID. People care so much more about, like it really raised its profile. And biodiversity as well, which we haven't heard a lot of yet, but I think we will in the next couple of years, because it's really our members at a global level. Those are the three big pillars. But at a local level in Australia, our members are grappling with what that looks like now, and we've got those challenges in biodiversity that we had in carbon like 5 and 10 years ago, where we need really clear. We've got to really collaborate there and get really clear targets. We've got to get really clear ways of measuring. We've got to view nature as connected to the other sustainability issues. And I know climate is really, really important, but I feel like we're covering that already. Because our three big ones in Australia are circular economy, climate change, and biodiversity and nature. And I'm focusing on biodiversity and nature in my 5 minutes just because we've covered the others so much. But in terms of nature, it's got to be connected. We've got to consider it through the whole life cycle of the building, and that opportunity for collaboration right from site selection, or that, from government land release through to site selection, through to the design, construction, the operation, and the social value that you can include through that whole process when you speak to people right at the start. We've got a real opportunity there for buildings not just to improve or like to do less harm, but to actually enhance the biodiversity of the communities that they sit within. And we're seeing that in Australia at the moment. We had our first, we set the ratings tools for sustainable, what is like that benchmark. It's not a silver bullet, as Selina pointed out. But Green Star Buildings was released in 2020. That really did set really ambitious targets for what a holistic, sustainable building could be in the Australian market. And we've just seen the first building come through under that rating tool, which was 80 Ann Street up in Brisbane. And they had, a completely holistic look. They were net zero, ticking the climate change area. But in terms of biodiversity, they did a massive planting of 100% Australian plants, most of which were local to the area. Like we're seeing our buildings rise to this challenge. But we also need to also need to design out waste. The third point is the circular economy bit, and we need to design out waste. And the tech solutions that we're seeing here, we've already seen some in the and we spoke last night at the speakers' dinners about some of the innovations that people have had of just reducing our material use, not getting that waste to the site originally, is a really big opportunity for us in Australia, well, globally. And then moving to a more regenerative system. So those are kind of bigger, broader themes than our local Australian market. But I think when we're looking at the three big areas in Australia, we need to look at biodiversity and circularity alongside climate change, as we all,
Thanks, Helen, and feeding nicely into some of the comments around waste, Mathew, that you were talking about last night.
Yes, and the ill-fated plasterboard wall, much maligned, or hopefully soon to be maligned. You've obviously heard a lot more from me today than the others, so I'll just make a few remarks that won't be surprising to anyone. I think to do better, bolder, we obviously need to invest in and incentivise this culture of innovation that I spoke a lot about. At a really basic level, that means funding R&D and actually doing R&D. I think from a government point of view, it means picking winners. And it does not mean that we will just treat all of the procurement of new projects and new ideas the same as we always have and hope that somehow magic will happen and great ideas will bubble up into the public realm. I think this is what government should be doing and figuring out how to incentivise that kind of innovation. The other thing that I would say to do better, bolder, is really about concentrating on doing more, but with less. I see a lot of talk at the moment. I did a little bit of a back of the envelope the other day to tally up the number of announcements from state and federal governments, and I'm not claiming here to have the exhaustive number, but I got $20 billion worth of recent announcements. Wake up, Mike.
Halfway, mate.
Yeah. Thank you.
He's holding us accountable.
That's fantastic. Yeah, lots of big announcements. Mike mentioned the press release. Lots of big announcements, but I think we all know it's going to take more than just funding to break the back of this thing. We're constrained, and we need to do more with less. We need to grow capacity of the industry, and we need desperately to grow productivity. And I'm super happy that we could kick off this morning with two brilliant presentations that demonstrate exactly how that can happen. There are solutions out there in the market, in some cases, that companies have been working on for 2 decades that can help us do this. So enough from me.
Yeah, thanks, Mathew. I'm going to go back to Mike, and because that's super interesting, the meeting with the building ministers, and I want to ask you a bit more about that, because we're coming up to a month since the federal government passed the Housing Australia Fund. We've had the New South Wales budget passed down. We've had a whole round of housing summits and roundtables in every state. But what levers need to be pushed if we're going to get that 1.2 million homes by 2029? And are the government, to me, the government have those levers, they've got the hand hovering above it. Do you get any sense from the building ministers that they're going to do that?
Yeah, look, I think certainly there's a tremendous amount of goodwill around the table there and quite a deal of expertise. And I say that with some reservation, having watched the sector, as many of you in the audience will have, for 25 years. So I'm also painfully aware that these days people cycle through their portfolios, every 2 or 3 years they get a briefing note and they probably turn to their key advisor, what they'd call a SPAD in the UK, and say, what are the 2 or 3 that we need to talk about a lot until I'm in my next highest ministerial portfolio or Prime Minister or Premier or whatever else, so that I can just get through this difficult thing, which is the poison chalice of planning or building or whatever else. And we all know how complicated those things are, because they're about a negotiation about people's living space or future living space or who else might come into that space. And so the licence to operate for a minister or a developer or any one of us who's in that food chain is always highly contested. And in the era of social media, even more so. And every party has now worked out that, say for example, housing is the fault line of the next 4 or 5 elections at a state and federal level, bar none. And all the research points to that again and again. So every party, no matter how high-minded or low-minded you might think each of them are, is weaponising the hell out of this, right? And they are You know, you watch the Coalition, they were totally absent from the HAF debate. You watch the Greens, they were up in it. Both of them have a very strong business model related strategy around housing. One of them's obvious, one of them will become obvious in time. It's fascinating, right? It's super highly contested. I don't shy away from that. I think we should lean into that conversation. I think we have to, you know, have the conversation. The sort of work that Philip's doing, I wouldn't call it beautiful, Philip. I'm not having a crack at you. I think it is. I think it's beautiful in terms of policy outcome, right? You're getting sustainability, you're getting all the great things there. You've got your transport location. I don't think any architect in this room is going to go and embrace that. I'm sorry, mate, you missed that. But it's what would we call it? An elegant enough square-shaped box. It's beautiful on the inside, right? But that's where we have to go, right? That's the sort of density, that Parisian, that European density, that is the future of Australia, whether we like it or not. If you want to have your kids grow somewhere, you know, grow up somewhere, raise their family somewhere near you, assuming they can afford to, given, you know, the impending climate changes that we were looking at the beginning of Philip's slide, which I tend to agree with, that's going to require greater density around transport, around, you know, particularly around the opportunities that big cities provide. If you're going to have ageing in place or near place, right, like you're not going to age in your own home preferably, you're going to age somewhere in a communal environment where aggregation of government services is going to be more efficient, that's going to happen because of density. You know, we're complicated creatures, human beings, right? You know, 5,000 years of aggregation around metropolitan areas because of the opportunity, educational, social, employment-wise, and then the moment it starts changing away from what we experienced 10 years ago, it's like too much change. Wow, I really don't like this. But all of these cities are going to keep on changing radically and rapidly, and we just all have to develop a higher level of comfort with higher density living. You know, done well, done appropriately, fixed around public transport, but we must do that as a nation, otherwise we're going to squander this opportunity to close the gap on housing and a couple of those other things. The only other thing I would say is this is going to involve importing skills and perhaps even unskilled labour, to be honest, and that is an entirely different debate which the country is not quite ready to have yet. But we will not make these targets unless we've got enough people there to essentially prosecute that heavy labour on three fronts. You know, we've got the green revolution, we've got the infrastructure that's been coming through the last 5 or 10 years, and we've got the housing heavy lifting to be done. That is an awfully large number of people that need to come in, because we will not make 191,000 new construction jobs that we need by 2034 in Victoria alone without importing some of that talent.
Yeah. Anyone else like to comment on Mike?
I want to ask Mike a question about the building ministers, who are not all called building ministers. In fact, it's quite a varied list of portfolios that those various state ministers hold in their jurisdictions. Is there anything you can say about the mood in the room last Friday when they got together, about how they understand the urgency of the problem and their role in solving that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk out of school for fear of never being invited back, and having been quite a proponent for us being invited along in the first place, I certainly don't want to, wee on the carpet like a new puppy. I think, don't quote me on that, Tina. That is a private comment said just between us friends. Look, they were very optimistic and they were very engaged with what we were saying. But the way I like my ministers and my decision makers the best is they actually came with intent. So they all had something to say to us about their willingness to lean in and to work with us. And this was everybody. The engineers, the architects, ourselves, the MBA. Everyone was there. So it was actually very collegial, and I thought very positive. And Ed Husick, runs a good meeting, so there was not a lot of time wasting, and it was very positive in my view. Just needs to happen again really quickly. That's all.
And my concern on that is just the conundrum between affordable and sustainable, because I think the sense that we all get very clearly from this is affordable. That is the big driver. And sustainable is sort of an and we know we've got to get there. But my concern is to get to the affordable piece, we will potentially skip over some of the sustainability potential here. Did you get a sense of where that was sitting in those conversations?
Yeah, they were definitely big on sustainability. I mean, it's interesting, you know, when we look at Philip's excellent presentation this morning, you do see there that quite quickly that you can deliver both, provided it's intentional, right? So if you're planning up front, and sorry, of course, I'm stealing your song ticket. Thanks. You know, it is actually almost from the get-go possible to be, you know, sustainable and affordable, as long as that is your intention. So I might even defer on that front.
I think we had a question coming up about that, but I might just jump
jump
in on
straight
it
in,
now. In terms of sustainable, in terms of costing more, for the commercial buildings in Australia, it costs around 2% to use Green Star. People are investing about 2% of their budget, and they're realising the benefits from that immediately. So in the commercial space, we're already seeing that cost premium. The benefits of that outweigh the premium immediately, which is why we're seeing such a massive uptake of Green Star. There's over 4,000 buildings. CBRE did research, it was published 2 weeks ago, that showed that nothing new has come onto the market, in commercial office market, in the last 7 years without getting a Green Star rating. So it's there, the business case is already done. It's now residential that we're really having that conversation with. And because, from a research nerdy perspective, we've got the building baseline, the commercial buildings baseline study now and the residential buildings baseline study, and if you put those two together, residential buildings account for 53% of our emissions from the built environment. So it's a bigger pool and it's a more important area that we need to be tackling. And because we're building it so quickly and we're ramping it up so much, those buildings, the decisions we make now are going to be buildings that are still there in 2050. And so if we're going to meet our targets, we need to build sustainability in right now. Because otherwise we're locking ourselves into really expensive retrofits. And we already know how big that retrofit challenge is as well. So we've got the 800,000 buildings that need to be built in Victoria for new homes. We've got 5 million buildings that already, homes that already exist, that need to be retrofitted to exclude gas as we see more and more states move away from that gas network. And that's going to be expensive, and that's going to take the skills and the labour that we need to be building homes across into the retrofitting markets, which brings us back to massive imports of labour and of non-skilled labour as well as skilled. So completely with you there.
I was just getting permission to ask a question. So there's been leaps and bounds in the commercial space, which is tied to leasing cycles, and it seems to be sort of now hardwired into that real estate ecosystem. What are the barriers, from your point of view, to having that level of guidance structure around the way in which residential property is developed and maintained?
Well, happily. Thank you for that question. For the commercial...
Not rehearsed.
For apartment buildings, so multi-unit residential, that's built into the Green Star Buildings rating tool. We did massive upgrades in 2020 and pushed those benchmarks up further, so they're now aligned with the Paris commitments. As we see build to rent come more and more into the market, that should be picked up in that space. So if we park individual apartment buildings there. But in terms of homes, it's a massive challenge, which is why we developed the Green Star Homes rating tool, and now I sound like a sales rep for Green Star. But the challenge there was the complexity. And so what we've done in that environment is tried to make it as simple as possible. So while with Green Star, you can get 100 points across 8 different categories, and you can pick and choose in your design how to do it. For Green Star Homes, there's a checklist and you've got to do everything. It's simple, it's clear, and there's not a multiple of star ratings. So you don't get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stars. You either have a Green Star home or you don't. And we've designed it in a way that commercial builders can pick it up and use it and offer it as a product line. So hopefully, as we see more and more greenfield developments in particular roll out, we'll see them pick up the Green Star home standard. And we're seeing those now. We've got 7 projects certified under that. So it's already had quite a good uptake.
And Helen, who's taking it up? Is it the big developers or the niche privates? Who are in that 7?
It's a bit of mix, but Mirvac's done the first one.
Okay. Yeah. Did Mathew?
I just wanted to get our personal direct line to Canberra, Mike Zorbas, in the shape of Mike Zorbas, to maybe press a little bit more on the Building Ministers Forum in relation to some of the other things that we've been talking about this morning. And I guess, did you get a sense, Mike, that there will be a move beyond the announcement, policy sort of as announcement, into a less timid position about sort of getting hands into the machinery? And the example that I would use for what isn't timid is what Helena Lidlow presented to us in the shape of the Million Homes project that was carried out in post-war Sweden. 1 million homes, and this would have been at a period, I'm not an expert on Swedish history, but I would have said that at that time that the population of Sweden would have been about 6 million. It's 10 now. And they developed their 1 million homes, and it's a full-scale whole of society effort to get those homes, the effects of which Helena very eloquently showed, which is now they have a 45% penetration of industrialised techniques into the multifamily. In the single-family home space, they've got a penetration of above 80%. So the long tail of that kind of very bold push is evident today. Did you get a sense that there's anything of that ilk brewing?
I mean, really, like, is there going to be anything confidential about this meeting at all by the time we get
Not
to
by
the end of this panel? No. Look, I think...
Or maybe your general sense. It doesn't have to be particular to the meeting. And your conversations with the
hypothetically speaking,
government.
I think the issue with... Let's go philosophy of government for a moment. I think the issue with the classic Westminster style of particularly national, the federal cabinet as opposed to the national cabinet, is not everyone who's wearing the right hat is in the room at the right time at a building ministers meeting. And they're not always the empowered decision maker within their own family of decision makers, like the cabinet at a state level or the cabinet at a federal level. So, you know, Sonia Kilkenny's there, she's a planning minister and a building minister, but Mick de Brenny's slightly different again, and so forth and so on if you look around the Federation. I think the Albanese government as a whole has certainly through the National Cabinet process created the space in which this next module can be fitted. That is to say, where does innovation get us? And I think it's probably actually the missing piece of this engine, to use your Ford Falcon. It won't run without the engine. Analogy from this morning. I think we need to keep feeding that in there. You know what I mean? This is already quite a massive leap from where we were a couple of years ago, conceptually, for the Federation to act as one, to do the right thing in this space. I know we're not just talking about resi. It is, however, the barbecue stopper that will, you know, keep on getting hotter and hotter. More burners every election, no question. And it's a good Trojan horse for generally talking about the good planning of our cities and the good planning of industrial and the allocation of commercial lands and how we actually, you know, keep on building better cities. But yeah, look, I mean, there's certainly a willingness there. I think we need to bring that international expertise into contact with decision makers, or indeed get them all along to your next study tour. Like that is a big thing to be exposed, not just by desktop research, but to see and to feel. I've been on a few of these things over the decades. You know, it changes your worldview. It changes your understanding of what can be done and how, and it gives you that connectivity to the rest of the world, which, of course, you know, Australia has done a lot of really leading stuff, and Green Star is a fantastic example of that, and many of the things that are done here are among the best there can be. But if resi's the next space, well, gee, we're certainly going to need to step up to match Europe there. And of course, investors expect that now, you know, so that will trickle through very quickly. The international accounting standards, everything else is changing very rapidly and pleasingly in that way. And we've just got to tap into that expertise that already exists, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere. Yeah,
and good point around sustainability. I mean, the Australian industry embraced it under the leadership of Green Building Council. And I was just talking to Helen, you know, the GRESB benchmark is coming out next week, I think. So far, Australia has won that globally 12 years running. 13 years. So will this be 14 years? 14. Yeah, so, you know, we're a smart industry that will embrace new ideas. So where are we getting to the tipping point with innovation, as you were saying? But I would say led by industry in that case. I wanted to talk about, we were talking about the housing figures and the new builds and the retrofits, but I want to talk about our cities, because we all know post-COVID our cities have forever changed, and what our housing and community needs in our CBDs are very different to historically what they were. So, Selina, I know you've done a lot of work in this area and some with the Property Council, but what do we need to be immediately focused on if we're going to align our CBDs with actually what the community is craving for right now?
Yeah, look, it's been, I could talk for hours on the future of CBDs, and we teamed up with...
Yeah.
Well,
You've got 3 minutes,
that will keep me on time. And we've done a lot of work with the Property Council during COVID, post-COVID, to really face into what was the future of CBDs, what was this huge impact. And we've all heard it, talked about it, seen it, felt it in our experience of how we interact with our CBDs and what they look like now versus what they were like in 2019. So I won't sort of labour that, but EY's done a couple of good reports with the Property Council in that space. And the interesting piece is you go back and read that report, which came out in 2020 on sort of the future of CBDs, and it's actually stood the test of time really well in terms of the recommendations. The one thing that we did, which came out about 2 weeks ago, which sat on the shelf a little bit with the change of government in New South Wales, but was taking some of the work around how do you revitalise CBDs, because we've all seen the stats and felt the tumbleweed go down the middle of Collins Street or wherever you happen to be in a CBD on certain days, particularly if it's Monday or Friday, and it's raining. And we've looked at how do we actually try and get the confluence of solutions around this. And what we've seen is that building owners and city councils and employers are all there trying to work out how to revitalise their cities, how to get people to come back. And so we've been working on this idea around micro districts. So how to, rather than all of those groups running down their single swim lane or swimming down their single swim lane, how do we actually come together around a micro district which we can define really clearly and get all of those players to come together? So we've been doing some work in Sydney around Wynyard Park. How can you take the sort of pigeon-infested, rat-infested green space, which is actually really rare in that part of the CBD, and get all of the employers and building owners and retail around there to come and actually change the fabric of that small micro district, and then from little things, big things grow. So that's just a couple of the ideas we're looking at on a real practical revitalisation point of view. Thankfully, I think we have moved on from the big sugar hit event, big spend of money to kind of get people to come into the city on one day for one big thing and then just revert to whatever their behaviour pattern was before. It's about creating opportunities for sustained new behaviour pattern creation, and that involves all those groups coming together. The other thing, linking back to the housing crisis, is to also look around the concept of retrofits, hugely controversial in my hometown of Sydney. Just read the Sydney Morning Herald. But the idea of sort of potentially retrofitting buildings to have more apartments, more residential, as we've seen in many European and some US cities like New York, where there is that real great confluence of resi and commercial and cities that are lived in, CBDs that are lived in, and also the infill piece. So how do we do the retrofits? How do we look at the infill piece around those CBD and inner urban environments? So there are a couple of the things that I think we really need to focus on. There's some interesting projects that are going on at the moment to look across those CBD buildings, which ones could be ripe for retrofit, because whilst you can say that, it's in practice quite hard to do, and there's a lot of limitations around a number of the buildings for those conversions, but I think we do have to apply creativity and innovation, because we are going to see the desire for those green buildings with reduced footprints and demands and people coming into the office. We are going to see that next tier of office space just increasingly become more empty. That trend is only going to continue. So what do we do with those quarter full, half full, empty buildings? And Key Quarter is a great example of a beautiful building in Sydney which managed to retain a core part of the building, have a retrofit that was translating across again to commercial, but really reduced the embodied carbon footprint of that building. So I think there are really interesting, innovative solutions, but again, skate to the complexity. None of this stuff is easy, but it needs to be solved.
Yeah, and all those, those empty, half-empty buildings are near lots of public transport. So, in terms of infrastructure, half the problem is solved. And then you've got your complexity. Helen.
I just wanted to pick up there on that retrofitting and the massive savings there and potential embodied carbon, and the need to pick that up at a national level and have it in the NCC as soon as we practically can, which will probably be 2028. But it will make well, yeah, you laugh, but that's fast. But the opportunity there for retrofitting, both in commercial and in residential, rather than knocking down and rebuilding, and really starting with what can you do with the building. And how can you improve it, and what can you keep, rather than starting with a so starting with a whole lot of landfill and a hole, which is where we've seen buildings in the past start. So when we're seeing that shift, and we've seen a number of Green Star rated buildings that have done exactly that retrofit and rebuild.
And Cameron, I was going to actually ask you on that. One of the ones we were talking about last week was also how do you look to de-specify and de-scope buildings? So do we really need the marble foyers? Is there a way to create beautiful buildings that people want to go to that are really pared back and stripped back, and we reduce the carbon footprint from just taking a real approach around de-specifying? Are you seeing there's many people coming with that brief?
Yeah, I was going to make a comment and then I'll answer that one, which is the first. In terms of this community's relationship with the federal government, there's the micro district, there's the individual building, but it would seem to me there's a need quite urgently to zoom out to the idea of a national population strategy that we perhaps set and agree to and stick to, because there's no way of actually achieving any of these individual goals without the federal, I think in the federal domain, having some sense of what we do think a 2050 population distribution, city occupation might look like, which starts to suggest the way in which some CBDs might grow and others we might accept the status quo or slow decline as being inevitable for those locations. The question of specificity in architecture is a really old one and a good one. I think it's, we do need to reflect that the idea of the commercial office building, again, not quite a new idea. The loose fit, resilient buildings of the 19th century, the warehouses, the factories, the terrace houses, continued to be just about the most loved building stock in our capital cities. It is so because it is inherently open to adaptation. The commercial office building, the car park, the hospital, and those building types that were invented in that moment of modernism are proving to be really difficult to deal with. They're more resistant to adaptation to different uses over time. Our Institute gold medalist this year is an architect called Kirsten Thompson, and her rhetoric around loose fit and the architect taking responsibility for the frame or the structure and being less concerned with what an academic from UQ has called in Kirsten's work the sweet lickable bits of architecture, as in island benches, pendant lighting, marble splashbacks. If we could find a way of setting aside some of those real estate predilections, we might find a way of making buildings that are more like those buildings of the 19th century that we continue to adapt over and over and over again.
That's cool.
Can I jump in on the retrofit train and say that we too at the CRC are hugely fascinated by this, and we note the uptick across the country in all of the organisations who are advocating for change in the built environment around this very issue. I mentioned last night that we intend to do research work to help develop what we think of as retrofit kits. And I would bring it back to something that Selina said in terms of de-specifying and something I mentioned at the outset as well, which is trying to do more with less. I think if retrofit's clearly there as a big opportunity at the moment. We've all identified that. The vast majority of buildings already exist. But if we approach it with exactly the same methodology that we do the rest of conventional or traditional building, then we'll be missing a huge opportunity. And I had the fortune to be at the Property Congress a few weeks back that Mike chaired. And I heard one of a quite prominent player in the Australian construction industry say, we've looked at the figures, we've done it, it doesn't work for this kind of asset class and this kind of use. Well, to a researcher like me, that's a red rag, you know. I just want to charge at that. And I had a great conversation with Nigel Bertram last week, and I think Nigel's been earmarked to do a panel next year for the AIA, if I'm not mistaken, Cameron, to look at precisely this and come up with new, innovative ways to do this, and I think eventually to do more with less in the adaptive reuse space.
And I think that culture, I mean, Philip was saying, you know, the first one's expensive, you know, but what do you learn? And, you know, we have to, and you talked about that, you know, we have to have a culture that we are going to pioneer and pilot and learn, and then it is going to get more cost efficient. So it's sort of an acceptance that it might cost more the first or second time, but we won't get to the solution otherwise.
Am I going to ruin things by leaping on the back of the train that you were at the back of already?
If it's a Ford Falcon, you're welcome.
If I'm driving a Ford Falcon, I'll probably catch it, because those things, you could really fang them from my experience. As a young man, not now, I'm a very responsible driver now. I just don't want us to get ahead of ourselves on the death of the CBD, right? And I think that hasn't happened. I think we've been having a responsible conversation about that. We are growing very rapidly as a nation, right? And we're not all going to live in an online world where it's presumptively fine for us to work from home 5 days a week. The fact is, the diversity of flexibility that's been allowed over the last 10 years is wholly welcome. But there'll still be 2 or 3 days in the office for most businesses that want to sustain a white-collar workforce, you know, in coming years. And as the population grows, those CBDs will fill up again over time. It just won't be those shitty old buildings that, you know, have really been left essentially behind by modernity. And that's where that fantastic work on repurposing begins. We did some work here in Victoria with Hassel and Ethos Urban. It was out about a month ago. Identified about 6.5% of the commercial buildings in this CBD, so about 90 buildings that are in that pre-1990s framework that you were talking about, you know, that allows you effectively, you know, to retrofit well. And that is 10 to 12,000 apartments potentially. You know, it's about 20,000 people could come and live in the CBD if those were redeveloped. Now, we all know, and you're all leaping to say, but wait, they're all individual buildings and they'd have to be scoped and spec'd and FISO'd and whatever else. That is true, but the work is being done, the thought is there definitively. The only other thing I just wanted to say before we got off all of this is, right now out there in the industry, there are large parts of Australia where it is very, very difficult to make any kind of development stack right now. And that's for all the other obvious things that, you know, Mathew addressed last night at dinner and again this morning. You know, the cost of capital is very high. The cost of a lot of those inputs, it might be peaking, it might be levelling, but it's still incredibly high. So you talk to a lot of people who are commissioning projects around the country, and there are large segments of the market where things just are not going to come out of the ground, and that doesn't matter around short-term price spikes in various asset classes. That is just because the input costs are so high, the margins are not there. And for now, that is a strange backdrop, and hopefully a temporary backdrop, to a lot of decision-making and conversations that are happening. So when I sat there, and it's totally confidential off the record building ministers meeting on Friday that no one's going to talk about outside this tiny little group of just us, you know, they're also mindful of that. They're seeing that a lot on the ground, you know, Queensland, you know, parts of New South Wales, of course, particularly Sydney, you know, so that's also just playing out in the background.
Helen?
And I just wanted to jump in on that, because that smaller construction that's not happening, like those residential projects that are being held up, are now going to be pushing out the massive number of buildings that we need to deliver. But in Canberra, anyway, where I'm based on, there are a whole lot of developments that have been cleared and then they haven't got the funding to actually go ahead with interest rate rises. But that's going to have an impact on our labour force, because to become a builder or a plumber or an electrician, you've got to be on site, and the majority of those people are employed by small businesses, and they're coming through that small business chain. If those small businesses aren't having the project pipelines in the next 2 and 3 years that they expected a year ago, those trainees, those apprentices are being laid off or being put aside, and aren't building the skills that they need and that we all need as an industry in the next 4, 5, 6 and 10 years. So it's a problem for our supply pipeline for labour, not just for our slowing down of the buildings. It's a dual problem.
Yeah, running parallel. With all these competing factors and for every positive there's another challenge, Cameron, I want to ask you about how do we make sure that good design is valued and embedded in projects, because it seems like if you're doing a bit of cost cutting, I mean, Selina said maybe sometimes sustainability gets a line through some of it. How do you make sure that that's not the architecture line as well?
Well, and I think that's in part about distinguishing that design is not an add-on. It's baked in. Everyone contributes to the design process. In building, we tend to think of the architect as lead, but everyone is contributing to that process. So again, I return to that earlier point about collaboration and working in a multidisciplinary way. That's the only way in which design doesn't become a kind of a piece that gets value managed in the process, as we're struggling with these various concerns that Mike's talking about whether we can actually build anything in various locations. And
right now, is it baked in, or
I think it would be fair to say it's not.
It's not. So would it be half the industry? I mean, what's your mix like? Or are there different parts of the industry that appreciate it more than others?
Oh, I was just going to say that I had once written that to a value engineer, design looks a lot like waste, sadly. But I completely agree with Cameron and I think with the premise of your question, that it needs to be baked in. What kind of future do we want if it's not a future that values the end user, that values design, that makes people feel uplifted and aspirational? That's not the kind of future we want. And so I would also just point out that you've seen a lot about industrialisation this morning, and if you've been to other events, we talk a lot about that. We're not talking about some kind of dystopic future where everyone gets their own little existence minimum, where they can just have enough space to swing a spatula when they flip their egg. We're talking about something that could generate new value, additionality, and really respond to that consumer. And I think that's what good design does. And I think implicit in Cameron's comment is also the fact that architects don't have a majority share in design. There is a lot of different players that do that, and they all need to come together. So I would completely wholeheartedly write design value in at the heart of any new system we develop.
Everywhere I can possibly do in any piece of writing or information we're putting out is to try and put the word beautiful and sustainable together, because or else we end up with a kind of, as Mathew says, a kind of dystopian version. We've got to have future homes, future architecture that people are actually attracted to, because that is actually something that does build longevity in buildings if they are loved.
Mm. And the NCC in the commercial building space has certainly done that with the last upgrade, because they put Green Star in Section J as a compliance pathway, which means that you're tying that sustainability in right at the start of the project. And we've done some research with the Department of Climate Change around that and the impacts of it. And what it does is means that the sustainability people, and not just the sustainability people, the designers, the architects, the engineers, the building modelers, are then shifting to delivering a building that is sustainable and helping the client achieve a target that's already been set by that commitment that they've put in place at the start. And so it creates a really collaborative environment where people are working together towards a common goal, as opposed to having the building building energy modeler saying, no, that design's too expensive and you've got too much glass. It's everyone's naturally working together because you've made shared commitment. So everyone, sign up to Green Star, use JV1 and JV2. Green Star and Neighbours commitment agreements for your energy compliance pathways.
And also, Helen, I'm what we've been talking about, it's building that future for the next generations of more equitable environment, to building equity as well as the greener and healthier. So it's that combination of factors.
Can I just raise one other point that I feel like I'd remiss if I didn't raise it over breakfast yesterday with Philip, who was telling me about the hottest thing off the German press in the building space, as it were, which was the new premium standard, which is the rating standard in Germany for sustainability in buildings. And what's really powered that, if I understand correctly, and if I recall correctly, is the idea that there is a delta between what it costs to make a building that's far, far superior than anything we know. And if you already know about German standards, then you know that they're already pretty high. So this goes way, way over the top of that. And in order to incentivise that into the industry, government over there is offering, I think it was 0.01% interest rates on loans, which can be repaid over 6 years into the industry, which I guess is the rough amount of time that they're figuring that the value of that extra value can be amortised. So I just thought that's another thing that's really, really bold that governments could consider here, because it acknowledges that there is a difference in cost, that it does cost more to make these buildings that are a massive jump better than the ones that we currently have. And I think that's a really, really progressive use. And I think, I can't speak for your members, Mike, but I think that's a mechanism that the industry would understand and that they could get their head around and get behind. So, Thank you, Philip.
We're coming to the end of our time, so we're getting into our snap round now, where each person's going to spend 1 minute giving their thoughts on one immediate action that could be taken today to shift the dial. Because a lot of these are long-term, we're running towards the complexity, but what could we do today to shift the dial? Start with you, Cameron.
I think all the players in this space should collectively advocate for the federal government to have a minister for the built environment.
There you go. I'm going to give a bit of a rogue left field one that we haven't sort of touched on a lot, but having spent 2 weeks out in Palo Alto, the impact of AI, and I know a lot of folks in this room will be across that. For the sector more broadly, they're nowhere. And the stuff that is coming is going to be really material in all facets of how we live, how we work, how we play. And if you don't understand it and you don't have an eye for what's coming, that is going to really potentially disrupt business models, the way we get things done. So that would be my tip for the sector, is really spend time understanding. And it's not just a 5-second play on ChatGPT, like that's good, but it's really trying to understand what is coming in that, because it's going to be huge.
Yeah.
I'm smiling at you because I agree, but you also stole my thunder, and far more articulately than I would have. So let me improvise. Philip, I'm looking at you always. You've been a real lightning rod for me in this conversation, so thank you, and I'm glad you came out here. I think we need, politicians are creatures of anecdote, right, like the rest of us. So I think we need to expose them more directly to some of this innovation, and I think that really is about connecting the Philips of the world to our key decision makers, whether they be in Canberra at a state level, really inspiring them to go beyond what are the 3 things I've got to do in this term of government and parliament to allow myself to be, selected out of this poison chalice of planning or building or whatever it is into some greater future purpose. Not that that's the driver for all politicians, of course, but the point being, how do we inspire them? How do we inspire them to leave a legacy in those portfolios? And it's really, really hard. I'm not, underestimating how difficult it is to be a leader in this, modern complexity, and for the departments that support them too, to have someone who's inspired in their space, which may not be where they've spent 20 years training or spending all their skills, downtime or their, personal development. But they do need that quick fire inspiration. They do need to see something like what we saw through Philip's presentation, and maybe even, take a tour up north and have a look at some of these things in situ.
Yeah.
Via the CRC and the wonderful work that it does at its wonderful conferences as well. I gather, is this a record, Kathy?
Yes.
Is this a record setting?
Well
That's
done. Right.
Well
Our
done,
second year and a record. So,
congratulations, Bronwyn.
I think inspiring through what is already happening and possible. It's not a pipe dream of, we've got to invent something. No, we can just learn from best practice and bring it into the Australian context. So, Helen.
And I'd go back to the homes example. KPMG, so what we need to do in the home space is convince people that they want a sustainable home and that it doesn't cost more. And to convince people that it doesn't cost more, we have to make sure that it doesn't cost more, or we need to demonstrate that the upfront cost is paid back in terms of lower mortgage payments immediately or in the near future. KPMG has done that work and looked at the upfront energy savings across buildings. So they did a building in Sydney, Melbourne and one in Canberra and demonstrated the operational savings in energy and carbon emissions, but with the energy being the dollar value moment there. And there were immediate paybacks in terms of lower mortgage repayments. Like the energy savings were bigger than the mortgage repayments uplift for the cost of the building. So it's a really simple calculation, but we just need people to be aware of it and be investing up front. And the number one people that we need to do that investment up front is governments when they're looking at social housing, because those people, the people that we've got on our lowest incomes who are going to be occupying those houses are the ones who can least afford energy price spikes. And so we need to make sure that when we're having this conversation about sustainability, we're embedding it as building owners, but particularly as governments and social housing providers, so that those people are buffered against the climate shocks that we have in the future, both of energy prices, but also extreme weather conditions that mean they're going to have to use more energy.
And a sidebar, are the banks showing any appetite to promote that with
They
their loans?
are. You can get green loans now.
Yeah.
There are several banks that are offering them, including CommBank. Both in Australia and internationally, we're seeing a massive increase in green finance. And so you can get favourable interest rates. And we're also seeing local government do it. So in Canberra, for example, you can get low interest or no interest loans for retrofits for energy efficiency.
Yeah. I see your calculator, or the KPMG calculator next to the mortgage calculator, be fairly compelling. So.
Yeah, finally, I mean, I would concur with Cameron. I think we need a Ministry of Building. I would call it building, not built environment. But given that I've lost a little bit of faith in politicians through Mike's fairly full-throated reveal of that confidential meeting, I might actually put my faith
Which Tina's not reporting, of course, Tina.
More into a department, or let's call it maybe an agency. Is this an episode of Utopia? I'm not quite sure. An agency, let's call it, that would coordinate taxation, policy, regulation, training, R&D spend, and also help with the very, very thorny and difficult problem of coordinating between states and federal government and LGAs.
Thank you. That concludes our panel. Please join me in thanking Cameron, Selina, Mike, Helen and Mathew.